All right, so let's look at these bias strips. This is the cutting and joining exercise, and there were two ways to do it. One had an angle and one was a square. Do you remember which was which? Remember, we completely finished these. We pressed these and then we trimmed these to approximately 1/4 inch. So these look pretty good, and the outside actually looks pretty good, right? We're ready to use these, but these are samples. So what I've done, so I can remind myself about which of the ends that I did, is I did two more. I just redid the same exercise, but I didn't cut anything off. So now I know which way I did this. This had the angled end, and then this had the square end, and I didn't cut any off so that I could remind myself which end was which. So I believe this was the square, so I might just pair these together, kind of maybe pin them together, and now these are ready to go into your notebook. So what we'll do is we'll go ahead, we could pin these together, but what I'm going to do is I'm just going to label these really quick. I will label one of them, and then this is bias, cut, and join. And then my name and the date. All right. And then I would actually decide, actually what I'm gonna label is I'm gonna put in here parentheses square. And then on this one, when I label it, I'll label it bias, cut, and join. And we'll call this angle. And then I'll label the same on the other piece. Put my name and the date. And then I'll repeat that on this other piece. And then on this piece, I'll repeat the same. And now these will be ready to go into your notebook. Okay, so let's talk about this bias piping. So what you're going to be looking for on this piece is, first off, you're going to look at the consistency of the stitching. And it looks like the stitching is like pretty consistent. The next thing that you're going to be looking at is how snug this fabric is wrapped around that cording that's on the inside. And this is pretty snug. Remember, I did the second row of stitching that came in here a little bit more snug and tightly, and that's what we want. Because when we turn it, or this goes around any kind of curve, or it's going to go into a garment, we don't want extra fabric kind of bunching up. So we want that stitch line to be make that very snug. Now, the other thing that you'll need to understand is that this seam line here is the end of the seam allowance. So if the piping is going on the outside of a garment, which it normally does, is that this is actually going to be the stitch line, or between the two seams, this stitch line is going to be stitched, and it hopefully will be a little bit tighter than this so it doesn't reveal the stitching on this piping. So the width of this seam allowance will need to be recognized. So what do I have here? I think this is about 3/8. So if I measure, well, right here it's close to 1/2 inch. And then here it's 3/8. And don't worry too much about the inconsistency that it's a 1/2 inch here and 3/8 here. So I gave you a fairly wide amount of bias to work with. So it's okay that there's kind of an inconsistency there, because generally, whatever size seam this is going into, obviously this would have to go into a smaller seam allowance. We would actually need a wider piece of the bias for a 1/2 inch seam allowance. But this one, we're going to assume that it goes into a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we would actually need to cut this from this edge about a 1/4 inch. Maybe it's just a slightly more, just because of the turn of the cloth when it's folded. So I would mark a 1/4 inch from this seam allowance and actually trim off the rest of that. If we don't do that and we put this in between the seams and we sew a 1/4 inch, what's going to happen is we're going to end up with this piping sticking out too far from the seam allowance. And we actually have an exercise coming up in level 2 where we're actually going to be using this this piping for one of the garments on level 2. So stick around for that. So just be aware of that. But again, the stitching here looks pretty consistent. I've got the fabric rolled over the cording pretty tightly. So that looks like a pretty good piece of piping. So now what I'm going to do is I can label it right here on the seam allowance. So this is piping. And then my name. And then the date. And there we go. This one is all ready to go into the notebook. All right, let's talk about this cording or strap. I called it spaghetti cording or spaghetti strap earlier. So what I'm looking for is how consistent this width is. Remember that when we sewed this, we were trying to keep it, one, as consistent as possible while stretching it along as we sewed. We stretched it as we sewed, and we tried to keep it around the 1/8 of an inch mark, right? Now, if it's a little more, a little less, and it's not really that noticeable, it's going to be okay. So what I'm going to do is I'll just find a place and I will measure here, and I've got, that looks pretty close to 1/8 of an inch. And also in the middle, that looks pretty close to 1/8 of an inch. And that also looks pretty close to 1/8 of an inch. Now, you could of course make wider spaghetti, right? So if I wanted a 1/4 inch, I could make sure that that seam line that I sewed was a 1/4 inch, and then I would be able to measure a 1/4 inch with that strap. So just be aware of that. So this is actually pretty good. This is pretty consistent, so I like that. So now, labeling wise, this is actually not the easiest to label on. So what I'm going to do is, remember that wider end, I actually prepared a actual label here on another scrap piece of fabric, and it says cording, and I'm just going to write the size next to that, 1/8 inch, so I know how wide it's supposed to be. So I've got it, the sample name, my name, and then the date, and I'm just going to take a safety pin and safety pin it to the end. And that's how I would turn it in. And if your spaghetti strap cording looks like this, you would get full credit for sure. And now that we're all ready, ready with this, we can actually go ahead and put it in the notebook. So let's look at this bias binding. So this is the face side, and then this is the inside. So let's look at the face side first. So again, as I have looked at all of the samples before, I'm actually looking for stitch consistency. So I'm going to look at this stitch line. Are the stitches nice and consistent and straight? And they all look good. Then I'm going to look at the stitch distance from that edge. How consistent around is that stitch line from the very edge of that bias binding? And it looks pretty consistent all the way around. I'm also going to look at how well the binding actually wraps around that seam allowance. Remember, we trimmed just a little bit so there wouldn't be any buckling here on this ridge. And we also don't want any, it looks like buckling that happens along the ridge, but it's called roping, and that's when it inconsistently stretches around the neckline. So I don't have any of that going on here. So now that the front side, the face side looks good, let's look at the inside. So what are we looking for at the inside? Well, I really want the inside to look exactly like the outside, except I won't have a ridge. We have a little bit of a ridge for that binding. right? We won't have a ridge because this is the sewn seam, but I want that stitching to be on top of the binding consistently and not on the outside or way to the inside of the binding, right? So it's right here. It's pretty consistent. I got a little carried away out of track right up here, but if that's going to be going in a 1/2 inch seam allowance, guess what? Nobody's going to see it. So, but of course, if you're doing custom work, you want to probably pull out those stitches and make it look more consistent as long as it works on the outside of your neckline. So for the inside, this actually looks really good and it has a nice consistent sew line. One of the other things that I want to mention that I just didn't mention previously is that I don't want to see any of those original stitches. Let's see if I can peek under here and we can find some. So you can see it, but you won't be seeing it when it's worn, right? And that's what you want to see, that you've got it nicely pressed down and those stitches are close enough to that other edge so that when it's worn, this isn't going to flip up and show those stitches. So again, that's another thing that I would look for. But this is a good sample. If your sample looks like this, then you're ready to go. We just need to label it. And this is the bias binding. And then, as always, your name and the date. And now this sample is ready to go into the notebook. Okay, so let's talk about this bias facing. So this is the face side, and then if we turn it over, this is the inside. So let's actually look at the outside first, right? That's the most important part, right? We want to look at consistency. So the first thing that I'm going to look at, of course, is the stitching. Is the stitching consistent? Do the stitches look nice? These all look nice and consistent. Then I'm going to look at the width. What do you think the width is? It should be about 3/8. So we would actually note this in the industry using a tech pack that the top stitching should be 3/8 from the edge of the neckline. So if that's what the tech pack says, then this is what I would measure. So I've got 3/8 here, then I'm going to look at the center. I've got 3/8 there, and then I would look at the end, and I've got 3/8 there. So it looks pretty consistent all the way around. The next thing that I would look at is that I would look at the seam ridge along the neckline kind of very carefully. Is that neatly folded? Is it a consistent fold all the way through that line? And this one looks really consistent. So once I have that looked at and it looks good, then I would flip it over and I would look at the inside binding. So of course we want the inside to look as nice as the outside. So remember that I have a understitching that's gone here, right? And I can see that some of the areas of the understitching aren't very consistent, like for instance right here. While that's probably not going to affect the fit of the garment, it actually affects the look on the underside. Now if you're doing very custom work, this would be a no-no. So we would actually, before I would have done the other stitching, I would have ripped this out and done the stitching all over again because we want it to be as consistent as possible. The next thing that I would look at is the stitch line to stitch down the facing. How consistent is that? It looks pretty good starting, and then once we get here, we are kind of getting away from the edge, which means my facing might be a little inconsistent because when we just measured the face side, I had consistent stitching widths, right? So I may not be so harsh on that area because the front of the stitch width was consistent. But here at the understitching, I might actually take a 1/2 point off of that. And a 1/2 point just because it doesn't really affect the fit. But everything else looks actually pretty good. It's nicely pressed. I've got a good, nice, round, consistent, curved neckline that isn't stretched out on either side. So this looks actually like a pretty good sample. So there's just one thing left to do, and that's to label it. And I'm going to label it over here on this side. So this is my bias facing. So that's what I'll label it here, bias facing. And then of course my name and the date. And now this is ready to go into the notebook. Okay, so let's talk about the bound seam. I've already labeled this, so I've labeled it bound seam. I put my name and the date on it. So the first thing that I would look at is, of course, stitch consistency. And now remember that we started on the wrong side of the seam allowance and then rolled the binding over and top stitched the binding down. So I'm looking at the stitch consistency here, and it looks pretty good. I have a little place here where I got a little carried away, but that can be corrected rather easily. So my stitching looks good. The width of the bias binding actually looks good and consistent as well. So the other thing that I'm going to look on this side is also the width of the seam allowance. Do we remember what that is? So we actually did a 3/4 seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to measure from this seam, the middle seam right here, to match 3/4 and see if my seam allowance is consistent. So I'll measure here. I've got 3/4. Measured here is 3/4. And I measure here and I've got 3/4. Now I'm going to measure this side, check that, 3/4, 3/4, and 3/4. So that's consistent and that's important. So it's also important if you're using this as a design element and it's going on the face side of the garment as, you know, one of your design elements. Maybe you have a different color contrast binding which you're using. I've seen that a lot on designs. So after we're done looking at this and it's all consistent, everything looks good, then we're going to actually look at this seam allowance on the inside. We'll be careful not to mess up the pressing. So remember, we started on the wrong side. So what I'm looking at, I've got a good seam consistency here, but the other thing I'm looking at is for the stitching. So the top stitching consistency coming from this edge really should also be on just the binding, that it didn't come over here on the seam allowance or that it's not way off here on the middle of the binding. So it looks like we've got fairly inconsistent stitching on this side. Remember that little area I got carried away on. I can correct that. We can see it maybe better on this side. Then I'm going to actually open up and I'm going to check on the other side. Do I have the stitching consistent here? And it looks pretty good all the way down in the same spot, consistently all the way down. Down here I got a little carried away, so I'm not sure I need to correct that or not. It looks okay here, maybe. Instead of correcting it, I might just do another one just for my self-benefit, just so I know that I can do that consistently. So everything actually looks really good here. It's fairly consistent except for a couple of spots, which those can either be corrected or, you know, doing another one just helps you really learn how to do these samples even better. So now that it's labeled and everything looks good, it's ready to go in the notebook.